very happy to be talking to Bill White today, who was the very first person that hired me as an economist at the Bank of Canada, and I'm actually going to a conference later this week at the Bank of Canada, and I wanted to talk to Bill about a few issues, but before beginning, I wanted to say that when I made the transition from academia to the Bank of Canada, it was not an easy one for me. It was a complete shock, actually, because there were all these numbers and so on, and I wasn't very good at putting a lot of numbers in my head, and I found myself working with what I would describe based on my entire career. A lot of numbers people like Bruce Montador, Peter Jarrett, Brian O'Reilly, Hung A. Lau, uh, Peter DeGay, Pierre DeGay. There was a lot of them that were really on top of the numbers. And I was struggling one day and very unhappy. I was about to quit the bank. And Brian O'Reilly came into my office, who was my boss's boss. It was, in other words, it was Bruce Montador's boss. Bruce was my immediate supervisor, and so on. And Brian said, "Doug, um, I know things aren't going very well. Would you like to go out for a beer?" And this just wasn't Brian. Brian just didn't seem like a guy that would invite a staff member out for a beer and stuff. But what he did actually changed my life, and I'll say it actually changed some other people's lives as well because I used exactly the same approach on Brian that he taught me over that beer. And what Brian said was, "Doug, you don't seem to be very happy." And I said, "Yes, this is not what I had thought it was going to be, and I'm not very good at it, obviously." And what Brian said was this: I said, "Well, Doug, you can quit, but the problem with quitting, as opposed to giving it your best shot, is that you might come to regret not giving it your best shot and stuff." And so I went home from that beer and decided I was going to try and give it my best shot and so on. And I remember once it being at lunch a few weeks later, where Bruce Montador had said that the number was this, and I said, "Excuse me, but I think the number is this, Bruce." And I then remember Brian O'Reilly marching into my office and said, "Look, you were right. you actually, you actually had the number and so on." And that, that experience and many, many other experiences under Bill's management of the research department of the IMF, he had attracted incredible talent. Like, we had people like David Rose, who was effectively developing rational expectations models at about the same speed in academia as uh, as Tom Sargent and stuff. So we had a person like him that then came to the Bank of Canada along with people like Paul Masson and Bob Ford, who eventually became one of my chief mentors and stuff. But back then it was like we had this mentoring program, this culture of mentoring. But Bill, don't recall anybody ever using the word mentoring. But you were in management. Were you using the word mentoring back then, or is it simply because you didn't have a problem with a lack of mentoring? But tell me, were you using the word mentoring back then?
No, I don't think we were consciously. Um, I think everybody just instinctively knew that it was important to provide guidance to people who were more junior than you. In the same sort of way as when I was at the bank, I guess my mentor, although he never used the word either, was George Freeman, who basically was he was the organ grinder while I was the monkey when we were working on money supply targeting. And yeah, that was no, there was just a general understanding that everybody had to help the people that had to guide the people that were working with them and working for them. But it was only later, I think, that the psychologists and the human relations people picked up on this as a particular skill that needed to be taught to people who are management. So we just knew that instinctively at the Bank of Canada. That's all I can say.
So when I arrived, I was the consumption specialist. Okay. It was rather interesting because uh, when I was talking to Bill about my wage, I was trying to explain to him that I was going to be taking a nominal wage cut because they were paying me 23K at the University of Western Ontario. And I think the starting wage at the Bank of Canada was something like 17,000, which was about half of what I had two offers at commercial banks for over 40 and stuff. So I was taking a massive wage cut going there. You said you couldn't do anything about it, but I think in the end you bumped it up a K or something big, and I appreciated that. But I still never had enough money to live. Okay, and this conversation is actually going to be about the monetary transmission mechanism. So I'm going to kind of transition into that story about the monetary transmission mechanism because I didn't have money to live because I had two children and so on. I had to visit the Royal Bank that was just adjacent to the Bank of Canada. I'd walk in, and I'd talk to the loan officer, and I'd say, "Well, I need a loan to live," and the loan officer would say, no, Mr. Laxton, we do not give loans to people that to live. And I said, well, look, if you look at my income from the Bank of Canada, it's this amount. My rent is this much, and I have two kids, and now I have to wear suits and have to pay for transportation and blah blah blah. I said, how can I possibly live on this job? And she said, well, what you have to do, Doug, is take out a loan to buy furniture because furniture is an unsecured loan and I can give you a loan to buy furniture. It's also a good way to start your your credit rating to take out this loan for furniture and then pay it off and show that you might be able to then take out loans for bigger and stuff and so on. So I told her, I said, this doesn't make any sense, Doug, or loan manager. I am going to have a career where I'm going to make tons of money in the future. And I just want to get access to some of that money. And she said, yes, but Doug, as you know, there are moral hazard problems. And as we know, some people don't pay back the money. And as you know, because we have laws against slavery, there's going to be a missing futures market for labor. Okay, and that's going to end up being really, really important in terms of how we think about money and the monetary transmission mechanism because it's not taught very well in school these days still. So maybe you could explain how to think about the monetary transmission mechanism in an economy with modern financial systems and talk about where the gap is between between money and textbooks and how money is created and destroyed in the real world.
Well, I think the fundamental distinction is between many of the textbooks that basically seem to imply that um, banks just simply intermediate between savers and borrowers, the kind of loanable fund sort of view of the world. Um, and what that misses is the fact that banks don't, in fact, just intermediate. Banks also create money out of nothing. And they do it because they simply write up both sides of the balance sheet. So when you go into a bank and take out a loan, whether for furniture or for living, um, what happens is that the bank simply credits your account. So the liabilities of the bank go up. And at the same time, they credit the asset side of the balance sheet because you've got a loan that you've got to pay back. And this is essentially money out of nothing. Now, you might say, how is it they're capable of doing that? Well, I think the answer is that about 300 or 400 years ago, basically, governments or central banks, if you want to call it that, um, implicitly sort of made the promise that if you had a current account deposit at a bank, that you could use that and exchange it for a note, which was issued by the central bank. Okay, which is in some fundamental way really at the base of the monetary system. So it's this implicit idea that a current account, well, it's explicitly the case that the government or the central bank will allow you to exchange a current account for real money, which is a cash note. And so if that's the case, then as banks create these current accounts, they are in effect creating money. And this is a very important thing to consider because if in the limit you sort of say, well, it's all loanable funds, so that banks do nothing but intermediate between savings and between savers and borrowers, then in a certain way you can make the contention, and I think a lot of people do, that the financial system is simply awash, and it doesn't really make any difference to how the economy functions. And so, for modeling purposes, you can basically forget it. And as you will recall, I mean, when you think about the models that we had at the Bank of Canada years and years ago, the only financial instrument in there was a short-term interest rate that was determined by some kind of a reaction function. But the rest of, and maybe sometimes a term structure equation that sort of said this is what the long rates do in response to changes in the short rate. But basically, all the rest of the financial system simply wasn't there. And that seemed like, what can I say, for some, a reasonable inference from the fact that the banking system did nothing but intermediate credit. So I guess my when I first started off really at the Bank of in the central banking business at the Bank of England, I do remember it was never ever questioned at the time that banks created money out of nothing. And as time wore on, and I started to see more and more sort of textbooks imply that that wasn't so, the more puzzling I found it. Because I guess I felt then, and I do feel now, that the reality is exactly what I've described, that
So
central
what,
banks create
yeah.
money out of nothing.
So at what point do you think that you got it? Like, in other words, that you understood that the textbooks were wrong. Like, was
Well, I
there a
think that
time?
is, as I say, I think it started. Well, I couldn't tell you when it started because I guess I can't recall a time when I didn't believe that. And when I was at the Bank of England from 1969 to 1972, again, it was just, common knowledge down our part that that's the way the system worked. And to me, it always came as a surprise to see that people believe something different. And I do remember there was an article, oh shucks, I wish I could remember the chap's name, but he was quite a well-known academic in the UK at the time. And he had a model of the economy that basically had money being a function of base money. So the as it were, the school, um, the school that sort of believes, that banking is just sort of a wash. Their description of where money comes from is the traditional sort of money multiplier concept that money is sort of some multiple of base money. The central bank puts base money into the system, and that creates extra reserves that the banks are then sort of lending, they keep, a proportion of it as required reserves, but they'll lend out the rest, and that creates new deposits. And so it continues in this kind of chain, so that at the end, there's a kind of an infusion of base money determines a much larger amount of actual money in the economy. And he had this model, and I can remember this around 1970, and this model of money as a function of base money, and he did the regression. And I can recall that the R bar squared came out at some 0.992 or something like that. And myself and a colleague called Lionel Price, we got a research assistant to sort of get out his data sources and to look into it. And it turned out that somewhere along the line, he or one of his assistants had made a mistake in transcribing the base numbers. And that if you put in the proper numbers, that regression would have given you an R bar squared of one because it was an identity. But the point is that it's not the base doesn't create the money. It's the fact that given the amount of money that gets demanded at a going interest rate, the interest rate that the central bank is trying to set, and I can go back into that in a moment, given that interest rate and that quantity of money outstanding, the central bank simply creates the amount of base money that's needed to validate reserve requirements or whatever. So there is a link between base and money, but it's not that the base drives money, it's the money drives the base. And that's something that doesn't seem to be sort of generally understood. So what central banks do, I mean, this in a way goes back to an article written by Bill Poole back in the 1960s that central banks can make a choice using the instrument of either interest rates to control the quantity of money or using base money to control the quantity of money. And most central banks choose to set the short-term interest rate, leaving the base as the residual to be set endogenously, as opposed to the other way around, because um, the demand for base money is so variable that if they were to simply set base and in the interest of controlling the supply of money, interest rates would be all over the map because of the shift in the demand, the shift in the demand for base money. The base money demand function is very unstable. And Bill Poole was writing articles about that in the 1960s. So that's the way
Yeah,
it works.
yeah.
The bank set,
So we,
the central bank sets the short-term interest rate. And there are various means that it can use, or various rules and discretionary procedures that it can do to that it can use to do that. But the central point is it's the short-term interest rate that's the principal instrument of monetary policy. And then the question becomes, well, how do movements in the short-term rates affect things like the long-term, quote unquote, riskless rate, term spreads, asset prices, all those other things, availability of credit, all those other things that are really important in the monetary transmission mechanism.
yeah, I guess we would argue that another very important aspect of that is that it's not just the very, very short-term policy rate, it's really the expected path of the policy rate. And once one goes down that road, monetary policy and things like decision dates are kind of opportunities to explain monetary policy or the systematic component of monetary policy so that markets can better anticipate what the central bank is likely to do in the future. And that means their objectives need to be transparent, and the way that they think about the economy needs to be transparent. So there's obviously a bit of difficulty here because if we take a kind of a stylistic, very standard view of the transmission mechanism that's in the picture that we're looking at, we could think about adding risk premium from government bond deals to things like mortgage rates and stuff like that. But if Bill is right that it comes down to people like me walking into banks asking for loans against my future income and then ending up getting furniture loan initially. And once that loan was granted to me, there would be a matching bookkeeping entry. So two things need to be two agents need to be involved in the deal. One that believes that he's going to have the resources in the future to pay off the loan, and then of course a bank lending officer that will make the decision to give the loan or not, and so on. We have a
Validate
paper.
your judgment or invalidate your judgment.
So in the paper in 2014, we tried to develop. In fact, we did develop an open economy DSGE model based on infinite horizon representative agent and stuff. But we did successfully write down a model that had banks and a rule for banks that had two critical nonlinearities. One was the traditional Bernanke-Gilchrist financial accelerator, but instead of linearizing it, we worked out a model where you had endogenous credit default risk, and and the curve was nonlinear in the sense that the higher the loan to value ratio, the higher the risk of the mortgage, and therefore the if a system was regulated properly and risks were being accurately assessed, it created this nonlinear relationship, and it could shift. In other words, the degree of macroeconomic uncertainty in the economy could if it fell like it did before the global financial crisis, when there was tremendous underpricing of risk, what people call ninja loans, or loans made to people that had no income, no job, or no assets, and so on. So we developed this model, okay, and this model was able to achieve a number of objectives that we set out to achieve, but one interesting one that was kind of a very much a side product is that we showed that the demand and supply of credit is not like the demand and supply of apples. Usually, when we think of apples, we think of a demand curve that's sloping down and a supply curve that's sloping up. And the fact that those curves have different slopes allows us to identify demand and supply shocks and so on. And so one of the aspects of our work is that we looked at the effects of what would be pure credit supply shocks, were just the banks underpriced risks. So they gave too much credit to people simply because of their mispricing. And what we found is that looked, in terms of qualitative properties, very much like what we would describe as an increase in the demand for credit, because if the increase in the demand for credit were coming from something like people believing that their income prospects were going to be better in the future. And of course, if everybody believed this, the banks and the central bank and the consumers and the businesses, because of endogenous money creation, because of the modern financial system, you could actually move to the first best outcome faster if it truly was a result of a true reduction in the riskiness of the state of the economy. But of course, if it was underpricing of risk, like it was during the global financial crisis, that can set us up for a global financial crisis. And we showed that in the model with these two nonlinearities, one the Bernanke, Gertler, Gilchrist standard financial accelerator, plus an additional accelerator that was also nonlinear that said that banks, because of regulation, want to hold some capital, a buffer in their capital requirements so that they don't get too close to the minimum capital adequacy ratio and so on. And that was motivated by this idea that most commercial banks have a revenue model, and so if that revenue model, for example, is generating income from consumer and business loans and mortgage loans and so on, that they will not want to have visitors from the regulators popping in saying, you have been doing some nasty things, so therefore we want you to sell a bunch of your assets to get some additional liquidity, and they won't want to do that, of course, when they're in a place where the crisis is already broken out. They're not going to want to go to the market because just the signal of them going to the market could indicate that they are a bad bank, and as a
Yeah.
result of that, they would also face additional market pressures and so on. So we had a model of that, but the problem is it was kind of like one of those modeling projects where it's dead. Uh, as soon as you complete the project, you realize that it's not easy to generalize. And in this particular case, it was because if it was infinite horizon representative agent models. There wasn't enough heterogeneity in the model to basically develop a general purpose model that could be applied, calibrated, estimated for many different types of economies, small economies or or the global economy as a whole, where you have a bunch of major economies interacting and so on, right? So, but anyway,
But
I have some
but
good
it
news
certainly,
because next week, September 11th on Thursday, we have Shelva, um, who's one of our GFS students. He's recently moved to the IMF, and he's written a paper, and it not only talks about endogenous money creation from the perspective of the asset side of the commercial bank balance sheet, which is what Bill and I have been talking about, but it also includes the whole story about liquidity, or what we sometimes describe as the New York Fed view about financial crises and so on. So, uh, but Bill, did you have any enlightening words about this subject, about how this works in practice? Because in that model, because the qualitative responses of demand and supply shocks were similar, okay, that could account for the fact that economists. I remember the guys at the Bank of Canada that I think might have been working under you, guys like um, um, John, what was his last name? The guys in that were working in the monetary department. Uh, there was, I think, there were
Oh,
both their names
MFA.
was John from MFA. Both, I think both their names were John.
Yeah.
But they were trying to find stable money demand functions and so on. And and I think one of the reasons why it's really hard to find uh, is that it's not like the market for apples, where there's a demand curve and a supply curve. When there's shocks that you would describe as demand and shocks that you would describe as supply, it works in a very similar way in the sense that if you get an expansion in credit, you get higher output, you get higher prices, you get the banks giving good terms and conditions because they think good times are coming and so on. So, I mean, I think this is why it was impossible for econometricians to kind of estimate these stable relationships and so on. Uh,
Yeah, well,
yeah,
Doug, when in my early years at the Bank of Canada, when we were engaged in controlling the money supply, the way that we did it basically was to slide up the demand curve for money. So you'd estimate a demand curve for money that you thought was stable and useful. And then you would renormalize that demand for money function on your expectations about future prices, nominal income. Um, and you'd substitute in for sort of the money demanded, as it were. When you put it on the right-hand side of the equation, you'd substitute in the money supply target that you had. And then you would determine the rate of interest that was required in order to hit that demand in order to satisfy that demand for money function, let's say 6 months or 9 months down the road. And I do remember, I mean, some of these equations were, um, well, there was a reviewer of a piece that I wrote, I think it was in the reviewer in the Globe and Mail, who said, Mr. White has done everything with this data except take it down to the basement and beat it with a rubber hose. So it was, when I think about it in retrospect, it was data mining of the highest order. And of course, it all fell apart. Well, I'll tell you a little story is that you did this renormalization and you figured out what the rate of interest had to be. But in fact, even though the R bar squared was so high, the absolute size of the error term was so great that whether the interest rates had to go up or had to go down depended very much on what you thought would happen to the error term. Now, of course, this is not something in which you can actually base practical monetary policy. Or to put it another way, it turned out the demand for money was so unstable that you couldn't proceed on that basis. And you mentioned Paul Masson earlier on. Well, it was Paul Masson and I. Every quarter, we used to write a kind of briefing note along the lines of this is what the interest rate has to be set at in order to achieve your desired outcome in terms of the quantity of money. And the whole thing in the end fell apart because the demand for money function was just not stable. And I dare say, I mean, in the modern world, that looking for stability in any particular function is almost a mug's game. So you start thinking now about all the sort of substitutes for money, the money market mutual funds in the States. And now, of course, the next big thing is stable coins. And I mean, are they actually going to be part of the money supply, or are they actually, a complement to, a substitute for money? Anyway, all by way of saying that that sort of way of approaching things has got its difficulties. And we recognize this. I mean, gee whiz. back in the late 1970s, I guess, at the Bank of Canada when Jerry Bowie was the governor. And we'd all been so entranced with this way of conducting monetary policy. And then it was a very hard process to realize that this stuff that we'd really believed in was just not working. And I remember a particular evening, I think it was for Charlie Coombs. He was a top official at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And we had a dinner for Charlie at the Bank of Canada. He was retiring. And Jerry Bowie said, this is in front of 100 people. And I was sitting at the table right next to him. And he mentioned this point of, we were controlling the money supply and and in the end, the formula came down to saying, tell me what will happen to the air term and I'll tell you what you should do with your monetary policy. And he looked at me, looking at me across the table, and he said, and I want to thank Bill White, he said, for giving a governor a position on which he can really make a stand. And that was one of the most embarrassing moments of my early life. But anyway, um, stability is something is very hard to come by. I think the central point that you have recognized in the comments that you made and in the work that you've done is that credit, as created by banks, is in a way an exogenous driver of demand because most of the credit is given to people who want to spend the money. That's what it's borrowed for. And so there really is an important link there that has to be recognized. And I think to the degree that you've tried to do that, Doug, to sort of factor in credit as an important exogenous variable, driven in part, well, perhaps in large part by misconceptions about the proper degree of risk to take into account, that it's a very important initiative that you guys have taken.
Thank you. Um, I look forward to complete now that you're well, we're completing our little book, because I think it's a really interesting book. Uh, just over the last few months, just to summarize it for everyone, this bill is very pessimistic about the future. Okay, like um, no, not he's pessimistic in multiplicative ways, in the sense that there are all these bad supply shocks that are going to be hitting us, and we're going to be in a, because we've had excessive credit expansions in the past, we're going to be really vulnerable. Possibly central bank independence will, the kind of really bad stuff. Uh, and I've been trying hard to try to think of scenarios where we could be okay. And so these are scenarios that obviously require high productivity growth to deal with things like aging
Yeah.
populations and to make the debt stable, to make equity prices make sense, and so on. And and what I've learned is that when one thinks of AI, that one could imagine that there will be some countries that figure this out and that might actually develop what we describe as three C's policies, or policies that are comprehensive. Okay, that approach AI as something that you need to integrate properly into your educational system, and you need to figure out the income distribution issues and the wealth distribution issues. A lot of big issues to figure out that will be potentially disrupted by AI, and those countries that kind of figure it out might benefit, but the ones that don't figure it out, it is going to probably multiply the challenges that they're facing, and so on. So I just wanted to kind of advertise the first book is mainly all the negative stuff that the bill worries about, with a chapter at the end kind of saying, well, there might be some hope Unfortunately, when we look at the evidence thus far, it's early days, but the AI is not generating higher productivity growth. There's lots of investment that is going into AI. Some people claim that that's just because the people that are deploying the AI don't know how to deploy it properly. And going back to Bob Solo's work on
Yeah.
how to think about discovering electricity and so on. So it takes time to figure out the applications and so on. With
Yeah.
AI, it also seems a bit scary because there's some evidence that we just think of how long we've had ChatGPT, but there's already some evidence out of MIT brain scans of people that use ChatGPT versus people that don't, and how in these brain scans is an indication that people are seem to be losing their cognitive abilities because they're relying too much
Yeah.
on the AI and so on. And of course, in marketing, people are being manipulated with AI. People are making tons of money getting people to buy things uh, by stimulating them with AI. So in the
Yeah.
educational system, I think Korea, for example, was one of the, when you look at countries in the world for education, in other words, using AI in education, they had come up with what I thought was a really good idea. It was in a white paper for Korea. I think it was actually a white paper on education AI for uh, Asian countries, China in particular, and European countries and so on. And one of the ideas that they had to integrate it into the school system, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, was basically does what we do, the dynamic learning environment. Okay, dynamic learning environment is that you instead of the professor being just a person that you respect and tells you what the truth is and blah blah blah, the professor's role in a dynamic learning environment is to provide a bit of foundation and then let the students internalize the information and learn by themselves or in a group. Now,
Learn to
the
think.
problem with that the problem with that dynamic learning environment is that the student to teacher ratio uh, has to be really small and stuff, right? And so with AI, they had developed a program where you just think of a textbook, but with an AI powered tutor and so on. So uh, we thought this was absolutely brilliant, and we've been experimenting with it in the development of our own AI for economists and central banks in particular. But they just abandoned it. The new government in Korea came in and just said, we don't like it, and we just stopped it. So there's things like this that are going on in certain countries where they'll be experimenting with using AI, hopefully in what they think is responsible ways, and we will start to see results that are positive and some results that are negative, and hopefully we as a world learn rapidly about what we can take from this and what we have to be really careful about. Do you have any thoughts about AI, Bill? Because
Well,
with us,
item number one, I think, and I think you've expressed it well already, Doug, is that in complex systems, we always have to look out for unintended consequences. So that virtually any kind of move forward has to be evaluated not just by the short-term effects, but by the longer-term effects. And beyond that, and I go back to monetary policy here, that it seems to me that the desire to hit with some precision relatively near-term inflation targets um, has created a problem where you hit the short-term target, but you do so in a way, let's say, that it encourages people to accumulate more, more debt, more credit, and that becomes a kind of negative feedback over time that sort of inhibits you achieving your goal over longer periods. So unintended consequences you really ought to think through. And I dare say AI is going to be like that as well. And I'm not following it as closely as you are, Doug, but it does seem to me that there are a lot of people out there who are questioning the capacity of AI to generate prof the near-term increases in productivity and profits that are currently underpinning the stock market and the shares of people like NVIDIA that are not themselves in the AI business, but are in the business of what's the word, providing the shovels to the people that are mining for gold. And so we have a huge pyramid now of quote unquote wealth that is premised on increases in productivity and profits that might not happen. And then the question becomes, what about all of that capital? And I mean, it's immense what's going on at the moment. And it's essentially, I won't say all credit driven, but it's mostly credit driven. I mean, even the really big guys now are out borrowing money in order to build the systems and the data processing plants and the AI factories, if you want to put it that way. Um, I'm also very worried, as I think others are too, about the energy requirements for all of this. So we're in a world where we're saying that all of a sudden energy use has got to be constrained because the use of fossil fuels has got to be constrained. And yet, much of this AI processing, well, all of it is enormously energy intensive, um, which goes on, how can I say, and that comes in addition to all of the Bitcoin and the mining and so you can see already that there's all of this stuff has promise. I mean, I hear people say AI is going to significantly increase our capacity to deal with climate going forward. For example, it'll provide us with new ways of stabilizing grids to avoid the problems that they had in Spain, where there was too much solar and too much wind, and it led to a dynamic problem inside the system that resulted eventually in the whole thing failing. AI is going to help with that, and I can totally agree with that. But the other question is how much supplementary energy requirements are there in the limit pushing up the use of fossil fuels even more than it might otherwise be, and what will be the implications of that? So we're back into a world where it's unintended consequences. We have to work real hard to try to think our way through them. And I guess what I do worry about is I think, as has been the case with monetary policy for many years, not enough care has been put into thinking about the unintended consequences. And this really goes back a long way. I mean, I think Keynes, the famous line of Keynes about um, don't worry about tomorrow. Um, what was that? I'm trying to think now. I'm getting um, the biblical quote is Saint Matthew: "Take no heed for tomorrow; tomorrow will look after itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." Well, that's sort of the Keynesian point of view, but Hayek and von Mises and all those Austrian folk, I mean, over a century ago, we're saying anybody can predict the short run effects of your policy. The real job of the economist is to predict the long term consequences of your policy. So it's the same old stuff, it's just in a different way. But we really do have to put more effort into thinking about that. The other thing I think we need to put more effort into is It's not just the longer term consequences of policy. It's the fact that you've got a number of interacting complex systems. So the economy, the politics, the environment, public health, there's all sorts of them. And the problem we face at the moment is that each one of those systems is interconnected. And I guess I was sort of tangentially referring to that, talking about AI and energy and climate. Um, we should we should really be thinking, and maybe AI can help us with this, thinking about how policies in one system can have positive effects on that one system, but at the same time can have negative effects on another system. And a very good example of that is higher interest rates. And you say, well, I know that, higher interest rates will lower inflation over time, but higher interest rates also pull the rug out from underneath all of these highly capital intensive investments into solar and wind that are supposed to be at the heart of getting off fossil fuels. So once you start thinking about the broader stuff, you get into some very interesting questions about whether this is really good for us after all. So maybe, I mean, I'm an optimist in the sense that I believe that AI will help us think about some of these enormously complicated interdisciplinary questions. But yeah, there could be a lot of, what's the word? You can see there can be a lot of bumps in the road along the way.
Actually, Canada, I view as it's a country where if they could develop a plan, a three C's plan, for example, okay, that said, we have a lot of places where there's no population and so on. Some of those places are actually where our fossil fuels are, the tar sands. I know
Yeah.
that some people don't like to call them that because it sounds dirty, but our tar sands. And if you believe that even though fossil fuels now is still used principally for the transportation system, but assuming that we can EV that and so on, we will still need fossil fuels for certain things like fertilizing, stuff that is used to sustain the world's population, produce food inexpensively and stuff. And so if you believe that Canada had you know amazing growth prospects because we could build these nuclear reactors in the north, okay, and those nuclear reactors could also uh, help us get at our fossil fuels and process it much cheaper, or sorry, much better in a way that's much better for the environment. Because right now it's not environmentally friendly to get the tar sands because you burn natural gas, something that is pretty clean in the process. So if you could have
Yeah.
nuclear reactors, and of course, if you were thinking about things like the problem that you mentioned that was in Spain. It affected us in Portugal too. But the idea of how do you coordinate different energy sources and so on by having, a massive operation that could effectively electrify Canada cheaply, allowing us to develop, a first class transportation system uh, based on fast. We'd have a fast train in North America. That would be that are available in other countries. That could also be available in Canada, particularly if we had energy that was super cheap, cheaper than anywhere in the world because of the access to natural resources that we have and so on. But have you thought about the any kind of upside scenarios where countries like Canada could get their act together and actually use AI, realize that the world's going to need massive data centers, and there's no geographic uh, disadvantage because uh, we can transport um, uh, energy far enough into markets, electricity, and provide a very stable source of energy that could also then be used to liquefy the tar sands in spare time at a
Yeah.
on a very grand kind of scale. Possibly when oil prices are really, really, really high because we will have run out of the easy oil as Saudi Arabia is telling us
Yeah. Yeah.
that the reason that they're that they're setting 10 million as the limit is not because it's not because they're doing it to save oil. They just don't have any more. Their easy oil is running out, depleting extremely quickly. And this is another issue that actually the world doesn't plan for. The futures market for oil is extremely inefficient. In 2000s, the run up between 2002 and where it was $22 up to $150, people were systematically surprised at how difficult it was to find the oil and to get at it and so on. And we could be going into another one of those situations because I just don't think that we have. Well, that's a really good one of analytical frameworks. Energy Information Agency and International Energy Agency did not have analytical frameworks that integrated demand and supply and in fact, essentially the uncertainty in supply. Had they had that, they would not have assumed that basically you could just project demand out, to 140, 150 million barrels a day, okay, and assume that supply was going to be there without a significant increase in prices. So their analytical framework, in some sense, were just so simplistic,
Mm.
and so I mean, I think we can do a much, much better job in these institutions developing the analytical capabilities to be able to, forewarn people that
Yeah.
that bad times could be potentially coming in certain scenarios. So,
Yeah. Well, what
and
amazes me, Doug,
wonderful with
is
your time. Yes, yes.
what amazes me is again going back to monetary policy in our institutions is that and this I guess is where your work on credit is very important, and the nonlinearities is that everybody missed the great financial crisis. And after we had the great financial crisis, which couldn't happen, we had almost 10 years in a row where literally everybody, I mean, the IMF, the OECD, the Fed, and I dare say most central banks, were every year forecasting growth that was stronger than actually materialized and inflation that was higher than actually materialized. And that went on for year after year after year without anybody, perhaps other than you and your group, asking the question, maybe if you get it wrong year after year after year, there's something wrong with the underlying analytical foundations of what you're doing. And so I think the fact that you're sort of questioning those things and really sort of wanting to strengthen the analytical foundations is a very worthwhile exercise.
I would give a shout out to Raghu Rajan, who in 2005 Jackson Hole uh, talked about a lot of stuff, including derivatives markets and stuff that where he was doing, and yourself, Bill, who had been complaining about these issues for I think many many years before that, and so
Yeah.
on. But
Well, again, it's
but
sort of, I think Raghu, I mean, I remember being at WP3 and whenever it was 2006, I guess, just after Raghu had been savaged at Jackson Hole for saying what he said. that maybe you're actually creating more risk with some of these new instruments than you're reducing it. And I remember actually saying to him, because Claudio Borio and I had been savaged the previous year for saying the same kind of, for raising similar concerns about, too low risk spreads and too excessive credit creation and all this stuff. And I think, I mean, in the end, I think both he was right and we were right. And of course, can I say, it never, people never seem to sort of learn. So I'm thinking now about the Truss affair. Remember the Truss affair in the UK? And the starting point was an imprudent, a potentially imprudent budget stance that sent gilt edge rates going up far beyond the level that the Bank of England was assuming for their stress test. So that was item number one. Okay. Like we're sort of beyond the normal here. But item number two, and this goes back to Raghu stuff, is that it then incited a kind of that rapid movement in the gilt edge rates then led to exposures that demanded people meeting margin call cover, particularly in derivatives markets. And then everything sort of the pension funds found themselves selling gilts into a market that was already falling. And then the Bank of England had to come in and sort the whole thing out. And they did. At that point, they were increasing their balance sheet at a time when they'd already promised to be reducing their balance sheet, which brought the whole credibility of monetary policy into question. So the interaction between sort of ordinary market forces and developments that take place in these derivatives markets and associated markets that have been set up to reduce risk in various ways, those interactions can be really powerful. And I think Raju was quite right to point out you shouldn't assume that all of these interactions will be risk reducing, when in fact they might actually be risk increasing. So we're back again to the nonlinearities and all that stuff that you guys have been worried about, and rightly worried about.
Hey, I don't want to take up any more of your time. You're so generous, and I've been telling my students about you, okay? And so now they're studying the transmission mechanism in Armenia and Georgia, and they're trying to compare it to advanced economies like the United States and so on. So I'm
Yeah.
sure that they will appreciate your remarks today. You have a little note on endogenous on reviewing textbooks and stuff. And I thought what we'd do is we put that up on the Better Policy Project, like just convert it into
Sure.
like a kind of like a just a web page so that people can see some of these things in details. Also going to have a page that has all of our previous contributions of models with endogenous money creation and destruction. And we have Shelva September 11th, 2 p.m. London time is going to show us a model that integrates both the asset and the liability side of commercial bank balance sheets and stuff. So
Good.
thanks. It's really nice to see that you're well, uh,
Well,
and,
I
and
had a
that
rough July, but I'm back to normal, I hope.
you've recovered from your injury. Okay, so
Thank you, Doug.
ver-
Thank
very
you.
nice talking to you. Thank
And a
you
pleasure to
for
talk to you.
everything, Bill.
Talk to you again soon. Bye bye.